Over time.
Watts. Composer over
With Nick Versey. Composer overtime.
Watts.
Composer over time.
With Andrew over.
Composer over.
Composer and
Composer over time. Composer over time.
Andrew Watts.
Composer over.
Welcome to Composer Overtime. My name is Andrew Watts.
And I'm Nick Versey.
Composer Overtime is a series of interviews featuring discussions and works by innovative composers across the world today. Nick and I are both composers and doctoral candidates at Stanford University, and will be facilitating these chats each week, sometimes with Bay Area guests, and sometimes on location across the U.S. and internationally.
During each episode, we will hear a new perspective on the contemporary music landscape, find out about the composer's creative process and musical background, as well as listen to some of their recent work. This week our guest is Andrew Watts, an American composer living in San Francisco, California. Andrew has participated in a number of top festivals and residencies, such as Composit, Darmstadt, Etchings, Impuls, Ostrava Days, Rainy Days, and the Wellesley Composer Conference. Similarly, his works have been premiered by several leading musicians today, including Ekmeles Vocal Ensemble, Proton Bern, Distractfold, Quince Vocal Ensemble, Line Upon Line, soprano Tony Arnold, and cellist Severine Ballon. Andrew began his university education in composition at the New England Conservatory, and later received his master's at Oxford University. Currently, Andrew is completing his doctorate in composition at Stanford with Brian Ferneyhough. Andrew is concerned with the compositional applications of language desemanticization, focusing on the ability to convey expression through the voice, even when specific meaning is lost, augmented, or otherwise unintelligible. His writing also actively explores musical extremes through gradients of freedom and restriction, ambiguity and detail, purity and distortion, along with sound and noise.
This was a very enjoyable interview, with the structure being somewhat of an outlier throughout this series. Normally, Nick and I speak with a third composer about their work, but felt it would be beneficial to introduce ourselves a bit in order to help you all better understand our perspectives for future interviews.
Without further ado, here's Andrew Watts. And we're back here at my cottage in Woodside, California. Today we're going to be doing kind of an interesting variation in what we normally do, which is that instead of the two of us kind of interviewing another composer, we're going to interview each other over a series. So today we're focusing on Andrew's music, and I suppose that the purpose of this is to just introduce you to how we view our own music and how we view music in general, just to kind of give you an idea of what is the perspective that we're bringing to this podcast once we're interviewing other composers. So,
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for coming in.
Oh, of course. No problem. Happy to be here.
So let's see. So today, I guess we're focusing on two pieces of yours. Would you like to introduce them briefly to us?
Sure. The first piece is a work for soloist and electronics called Existentialism in Sound. I composed it the summer of 2016, I believe. I was very fortunate to receive an artist residency in Schwandorf, Germany, as part of a residency exchange with the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. The exchange was located in Bavaria and lasted about 2 months, and then immediately after that, the work was premiered at Darmstadt. Darmstadt, for those who aren't familiar with the contemporary music scene, is a very long-running biannual international music festival held in Germany. It was founded shortly after World War II and has been sort of the main meeting point for a lot of contemporary and experimental music over the 20th century. So that's the first work. I say soloist in electronics because it's for indeterminate soloist. Any instrument that could perform the sort of gestures that I notated would be adequate. And I've been fortunate to have a number of different instrumentalists play the piece. The premiere was by a phenomenal violinist, Graham Jennings, and then shortly after, another violinist performed the work. And then the recording that we're going to be hearing today was done by a cellist. I've had a Hagum player, which is a Korean traditional instrument, play it. And then I had another repeat performance of this work in England that was on percussion. There was a modified bass drum that played the same work. And the second piece is called A Spike of Resistance. It takes this notion of indeterminate musical material that could be played by a number of different performers and then applies that to 3 lines. So it's a work for trio. Yeah. Very good.
So we'll listen to those a little bit later. Obviously we'll talk in more depth about each of them. But just before that, maybe let's just get to know you a little bit and see, where it is that you're coming from compositionally. So I guess just to begin with, how did you get into composition?
Well, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and I was a rock guitarist in my middle school and high school years.
Golden years,
yeah. My formative musical years. And I guess because I grew up in such a rural area away from the big musical institutions, when you hear about people, especially of previous generations, playing rock guitar, in their teenage years, there's this notion of like, oh, the garage band and a bunch of guys just like jamming on stuff. And though there were some musicians in my high school, there wasn't the same sort of musical interplay and the availability to just hang out and play music all the time. So rather than that, I would just multi-track everything. So I'd find songs that I liked, and I'd play the vocal line on guitar. I'd play the lead guitar line on guitar, the rhythm guitar line on guitar, the bass line. I would tune down the guitar.
How about the drums?
I'd program a drum machine to do the drum part.
We have a very similar upbringing, I think.
Yeah, and I would just create these like digital entities of myself controlling all of the musical parameters. And I think that that's a very compositionally minded approach to the guitar. There's also this point where I was taking jazz guitar lessons up in York, Pennsylvania, which York is like the closest city to where I grew up. And I was bringing in sheets of fully notated guitar solos over famous rock songs. So I'd encounter a really famous recording that had a guitar solo, and I liked the song, but I was like, this guitar solo is not the most effective use of the material.
It needs the Watts touch.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if it was, I don't think it was arrogance per se, but it was just this notion of like, there's a more optimal version of this that I thought I could do. So rather than just improvising a solo, which I would also improvise, but I had this real desire to put on paper what I thought the perfect solo was. This is the document that represents as, efficient, as expressive, as soloistic, virtuosic as I could do for this piece. Mm-hmm. And my guitar teacher was like, this is very atypical for guitarists to have this mindset and to be so steadfast in documenting this. You should keep writing. The fact that you're even writing out these solos the way that you are and using these techniques and trying to notate the techniques, that's a very compositional thing.
Well, how did you think of yourself at this time? Did you consider yourself more of a guitarist, or had you even kind of formulated the idea of yourself as a composer?
I still definitely self-identified as a guitarist. I had never met a composer until I was first day of class freshman year as a composition major.
Really?
Yeah. So the notion of what is a composer today and what does the career of a composer look like as a 16-year-old, that's completely abstract. I know that towards the end of my time in high school, I had created an independent study where I did jazz composition. So I would just write these little jazz tunes and record them myself, and that was like one of my high school classes. But yeah, the notion of I want to be a composer was still very hazy. I liked a lot of film music at the time, and I think that the lucrative aspect of a film composer was very attractive. Of like, oh, I looked online and this is the earnings for John Williams for this film. Like, that's amazing.
Sure.
I want to be John Williams. That was really appealing. But it wasn't really until I started college that the notion of like, oh, there's this whole field of like composition within universities, and what is contemporary composition? What's the trajectory of musical development over the 20th century? Because when you're in high school, composition is so rooted in the classical era, or even the Romantic era.
Well, your idea of composers is really like, if you have no conception of what it's like to be a composer in the 21st century, or in the 20th century at that time as well,
right?
That you would kind of just judge the idea of what a composer is based on composers of the past who sort of emerged as luminous figures. So Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Mahler, people like this.
Yeah, it was so spotty. There were those sort of figures, and then there's John Williams, which is, it's clear now why I'm familiar with those figures and why most people, when they're in high school, are not familiar with Luigi Nono or something like that. But
there are also these kind of other figures which I'm sure were huge influences on you. Who, think about people like Frank Zappa or Jimi Hendrix, people who write their own songs, and you think of them as songwriters in many cases. However, the instrument that you identified them with is so strong that you would think of Jimi Hendrix as a guitarist before you would think of him as a songwriter in most cases.
Right.
And so I imagine that kind of mindset might also kind of influence how you view yourself as a guitarist who is also writing at that time, as opposed to a composer whose instrument is the guitar. It's this sort of odd prioritization of one thing over another in a sort of confusing way that is something that I think a lot of composers have to work through.
Yeah, when I started my undergraduate studies, I felt a very strong desire to move away from the guitar. Not because it was something that I didn't enjoy or something that I thought wasn't valuable, but I was in an environment where my colleagues had studied at Juilliard pre-college or Manhattan School, pre-college, these very intensive compositional studies while in high school at leading conservatories. And it wasn't that I felt like I wasn't good enough, but it was this sense of, I feel like I need to catch up. Where, of course, I had studied music very seriously through the lens of the guitar, but if I'm serious about being a composer, I felt like I needed a very strong foundation in the tradition. I needed to understand classical music, and my patchwork of listening to, Rachmaninoff and Beethoven and whatever I could, like, just by happenstance become acquainted with in high school wasn't going to do it. I needed to have serious devotion and understand the trajectory of this field. So that's what I did. I didn't bring my guitar to college, really. And there were a number of years where I was just composing, not playing an instrument, not listening to rock. It's something that I sometimes talk about, I guess with my family, my friends sometimes, where it's like a strange rediscovering of rock, years later, and I really like the guitar tone in this song. And of course, this is a song that I may have heard hundreds of times before, but it's strange how having these gaps and then you listen to it again, you bring in all of your experiences during this time away from listening to rock. So you're hearing it not necessarily with greater fidelity, but you're definitely hearing it and picking up on things and applying certain values that you've picked up along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you have a greater analytical ear after the fact.
Right.
So did you sort of, in this kind of what seems fairly intentional move, was this something that was, in your mind, considered like, at the time, obviously, like a temporary hiatus to go explore this realm of music which was calling to you in a certain sense, only to kind of like come back to the guitar at some other point or something like that? Or was it more of a decision to kind of like encompass just a larger world in general? And how has that worked out for you now? Because I imagine that a lot of the influences, especially in your self-stated rediscovery of rock music afterwards, I'm sure some of those influences have remained strong influences for you.
Well, I would say that they've reemerged as strong influences because when I was an undergraduate composing my own pieces, then I was also trying to understand the syntax of these different eras. And that's how most people are when they're composing and they're 18, 19. They're not writing in this highly original, very particular style. Usually they're trying to come to grips with what has already been done even.
Yeah, you're kind of modeling what it is you do on something which spoke to you successfully through another song.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until really I was doing my master's in England that I had this strange opportunity to program 2 hours a week as part of Oxide Radio, which was Oxford University's campus radio station. Mm-hmm. They gave me a rock hour and a jazz hour a week.
Really?
So I had programmed and curated an hour playlist for each of these. And that really forced me to look back into my catalog of like, okay, somebody's asking me to fill up an hour for rock music. What do I think would be an interesting hour of songs? I think the only restriction was within each hour, I couldn't have the same artist twice.
That's a pretty challenging thing. Well, I mean, there's plenty out there, of
sure,
course, but there's so many things to choose from in the end. And,
right.
Such a vast array of influences as well.
And I did that for about half a year, and I also imposed another restriction on myself, which was I didn't want to repeat any recordings. Mm-hmm. So suddenly you're starting to dig deep of like, okay, I've already played this, I played this artist within this week, what else would fit well with this? And you try to think of a listening trajectory, creating these. And through that like experience of digging through all of these recordings, I'm like, wow, this sounds amazing. Mm-hmm. Like hearing, Heartbreaker by Led Zeppelin for the first time, really listening to it after 7 years of not listening to that. Mm-hmm. Was like monumental. Mm-hmm. Like the guitar tone is amazing. Or there are these specific recordings. And then around that time, I felt like I had finally caught up in terms of my understanding of music to the present. Because it takes a long time for a composer to really digest what has been done in order to then say, like, okay, and what do I want to do? This is what has been done historically. I understand it. I like what this composer has done. I like what this. Let's see how I can move this forward into my own language, for the future.
What would you say were your, now kind of forming an understanding of your sort of influence in these two different realms, composers in the classical tradition that you gravitated towards as those who kind of called you forth from this rock tradition that you began your musical experiments and compositional experiments in, and then also those in that rock realm that you left. What would you say are from those two realms, who do you think are your greatest influences that kind of emerged during this process?
When I was in high school? You mean like what are the points of crossover where it's like, well, I was listening to a lot of rock and playing rock, but then of course there was some point where I started to jump over and listen to some classical works.
Well, let's say that, you had started, when you were starting to listen to rock music and you'd kind of developed this sense of what that world was like, to the point where you felt that you had probably thoroughly explored it to the point where you had an understanding of the landscape and that you could, in that style, make a comment that was original. And then that's the point, perhaps, where you decided, well, you heard new things that invited a larger understanding of the musical world, and you said to yourself, I want to go explore that because I need to shore that side of my training up as well. Those seem to me both to have a kind of saturation point, which you kind of reach a level where you're comfortable in both, to the point where you can determine which of those influences made the biggest impact on your own aesthetic, and which of those valuable artist styles, what have you, which of those you decided to keep in your own language as you moved forward in your own original statements. So my question then is, of those two different worlds that you explored, which of those artists do you think kind of emerged at the top for you as the biggest influences on your music today?
Well, that point of overlap was really when I was in England. It was a very fruitful year in terms of my output and very transformative. I had been teaching full-time in Providence, Rhode Island the year before, and I was driving up to Cambridge, Massachusetts on the weekends studying with a former professor of mine, Stratis Minikakis, just private composition lessons at his home. And he was very understanding that I was working full time. So I would show up on the weekends and he'd say, so Andrew, like, what have you brought for me today? Like, what have you been working on? And I would sheepishly say, like, oh, it was a busy week. Like, I didn't write anything. And rather than like chastising me, he would say, like, that's okay. Here, let's go over this. And he kind of outlined a graduate degree in composition, or at least specific topics, over these weekends, where I wasn't writing anything, but I was learning all of these concepts and techniques. And that was massively informative. And that now, when I then moved to England, I had all the time in the world, where I had very few obligations to, attend things, and it was just like time to work and research music. So I put all of those lessons into practice, into my own music, and that was when, the rubber hit the road, and I actually came to grips with these things and what actually spoke to me, what I wasn't as interested in. And from that, I think there's certain means of control that composers have used, especially post-1945, where they're creating self-imposed restrictions. You have this age that we live in today where you can do anything. Nobody's telling you you can't write that. There's no, especially national restrictions either, at least in the United States.
Well, there are sort of there are certain things that receive different kinds of reception, but in general,
of course,
most things are on the table, and more so than at any point in history, I would say.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's certain things that you might not want to do, or maybe you shouldn't do, but you can do it.
It's that if you do them, there will likely be some sort of reaction.
Right, exactly. So this notion of composers using very rigorous self-imposed restrictions to create a wall to then push against, and that push of having something that is limiting you was very fruitful to me, because it allows you to get over the blank page. The blank page representing anything. When you start a piece, it could be anything. And then suddenly it's like, no, I've created these boundaries, these parameters. The parameterization of music was really big, and that happened during that time too. So when I think about composers, I think of like, the composers who were using variants of micropolyphony in the 1960s. You have Ligeti being a very huge influence at the time. And then getting back to your question about rock music, I was very influenced by Fausto Ramitelli and the notion of saturation and timbral saturation, and bringing these elements of distortion and overdrive from the rock domain into the concert hall. I've always been a big fan of virtuosity, which also kind of comes from the rock domain.
Steve Vai and Joe Satriani and Randy Rhoads.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So this notion of like the guitar solo as the ultimate expression of the instrument, of the soloist, this singular mindedness has always been very attractive to me. And there are composers today who probably have not any relationship to that world, but to me it's like they're shredding. Like Brian Ferneyhough, a lot of his solo works are like guitar shredding to me, even if they're not for the guitar. And I know for a fact Brian does not think of this as a guitar solo.
I don't know that Brian knows the word shredding either.
Yeah, but I remember being exposed to his music when I was either a junior or senior in college, and I went through this weird like quasi 6 stages of grieving, only like 6 stages of acceptance of Brian's music, where I heard it and I was just offended. Like, who is this person? Like, why does he think he can do this? And then there was something inherent in it, though, that kept drawing me back, like this morbid curiosity of like, I don't like it, but I can't look away. And eventually it was not only acceptance, but like genuine interest in like, what is he doing? How is he composing these works? And I remember I heard Unity Capsule at the time, and that was a really big moment for me. So, yeah.
And that actually, something that you mentioned as well, starting from the blank page and kind of moving past that, creating a structure that you can kind of push back against. This reminds me of something that Brian actually said. For those listening, we should mention also that Brian Ferneyhough is our teacher as well. And in conversation with him, he's revealed quite a lot of very valuable things. And I think one of the things that he mentioned in a public forum that we attended was around the question, what does an artist do when they're not feeling inspired, or when they don't know where to go or where to start? And he said something to the effect of, well, the best thing that you can do is just to do anything, just to kind of put something down on the page, just so you have something to look at, so you can go, I really don't like this, but maybe this is what I would do to make it better. Or maybe the opposite is also true. The worst thing to do is not to do anything, because then you have nothing to look at and you have nothing to improve upon.
Yeah, I find that to be very true.
So another question, another question I'd like to ask is, so beyond composition, do you have any other parallel creative practices that you were kind of pursuing, not necessarily in relation to composition, but perhaps also relate to your artistic sensibility?
Yeah, when I started at Stanford, I was looking for a more immediate sense of gratification. Not that I don't find composition gratifying, I find it like immensely gratifying, but it was over an increasingly long time period, that gratification. So the time between the initial idea for a piece and then like that rumination of the idea, and then jotting some sketches down, and then like more serious pre-compositional planning, and then the writing of the piece, the revising of the piece. You finish the score, now you need to make the parts, you're shipping that out, and then you're having rehearsals, and then there's the recording documentation session. After you get the recording back, then you need to do the mixing of the recording, or the videography work. It could be 6 months, it could be 8 months, it could be longer. That was a very long time to sustain yourself creatively. I wanted something that I could do on the side during these long periods that I wasn't relying on anyone. As a composer, unless you're also performing your works, or I guess if it's just electronic work, but if you're not falling in either of those camps, then you're relying on the expertise and specialization of at least one other person, if not a team of people, which is really great, and I appreciate the collaboration, but also I wanted something that it was just me. I'm not waiting for anyone.
And it's immediate.
And it's immediate.
Or relatively immediate, as compared to, the suspension of momentary satisfaction for a long-term ambitious goal.
Exactly. So I got into photography. I was always a really big fan of architecture, and for some reason, photography is like a strange creative proxy for architecture to me, because you're capturing and you're then kind of lining up the world however you wish. So yeah, the first year I was at Stanford, I bought a Nikon DSLR, and if I had a long day and I was feeling antsy, in the evenings I would just walk around Stanford and do long exposure photos of the campus being lit up by the lights outside at night, and that practice of going out on a photo walk, having a collection of photos, culling through it, and then it's just you edit them, and then it's done. You can distribute them however you want. You show them to people, don't show them to people. That was a really, I felt like it was a really healthy practice that did exactly what I had hoped for. It balanced out my need for accomplishment, and that's sort of over time bloomed into its own side passion. Now I'm fortunate to travel a lot more, and I'm always taking photos of cities and street photography, cityscapes. So,
and I imagine also that having this kind of this sort of secondary practice, or something which you kind of develop initially on the side, which kind of blooms into something greater. I imagine that in kind of exploring that world, that it might even remind you of kind of the exploration of classical music in a certain way. And it might even, the fact that you've now kind of developed not just one, but two, but three different sort of worlds that have just been cultivated through your own research and practice, that you might start to also notice certain sensibilities that are common between these things. Like, obviously you found some sort of intersection between rock music and classical music, but you've also found, I imagine, I'm just curious to see how you think of this, certain commonalities between your own work in photography and your own work as a composer. Do you have any sense of this?
I do, and the clarity of the relationship has only been a recent epiphany. And I think it's because, similar to with composition, where there was this long period where you're just trying to catch up with the history. As a photographer, you're just trying to get the mechanics down and like actually understand how to take these different types of photos. What makes a good landscape? What makes a good portrait? Like, what are the principles? What are the guidelines? I think the similarity between the way I approach composition and photography is this notion of parameterization. So it's not necessarily the act of taking the photo that's similar. It's the act of editing, which with digital photography is a huge aspect of being a photographer. You have these very high megapixel raw images that you then have control over all of the parameters. You have control over every one of the color bands. You have control over the exposure, you have control over the contrast, you have control over the noise level, you have control over, all of these different parameters. And when you change one, then you probably need to understand how that's going to affect every other parameter.
Yeah, you become aware of the dynamics that are involved.
And that's in many ways how I view composition. There are these parameters, and often the parameters have a influence on each other. They're not just in isolation. When you change one thing, it's going to have ripples throughout that instrument and sometimes throughout the effect in the work itself.
So in that sense, also a camera acts as a kind of instrument because you can, in real time, kind of dilate the focus of what it is you're doing. So it allows you to kind of test all of those things in real time, as opposed to in composition, it's kind of like it's all a vision of sorts that you don't necessarily, unless you have an instrumentalist in front of you, unless you're playing your own solo piece or something like that, unless you have, real-time electronics that you're working with, you would not necessarily have the immediacy of that ability to focus in and out and test these different balancing of parameters.
Yeah. I often think of composition as like blueprints. We're creating blueprints for a building that is sound.
Very interesting. Well, maybe that's a good place to jump into one of your pieces then. Which piece would you like to begin with? We've got existentialism in sound first, and then we've also got, what was the other one?
A spike of resistance.
A spike of resistance, yes. So
let's start with the existentialism in sound.
Okay. And just to reiterate for our listeners, who are the performers of this piece, and where was it performed, and what are some other performances that they can listen to if they'd like to compare between other versions of it?
Sure. So the performance took place for this recording at Karma Stage at Stanford University. The soloist is this phenomenal cellist, Maritz, and I was doing the electronics. There's a number of other works for soloist on my website, andrewawatts.com.
Okay, sounds great. Let's have a listen. So that was Moritz Mollenbach of Ensemble Retro Disco from Switzerland, playing Existentialism in Sound. So Andrew, as we kind of touched on briefly before, this is a piece that was composed sort of elementally, something that had these symbolic representations which were not instrumentally specific, but more gesturally specific. And I'm curious, because it's been interpreted various times in various instruments by various different people, with differing perspectives, what are the sort of things that you noticed that were similar and different between the performances? So that is to say, things that you sort of saw as being true to the symbolic nature of the piece, and also things that sort of invited a variety of interpretations that you noticed between each different interpretation.
Each performance has thus far been executed on a stringed instrument. Even the percussion version was a monochord across a bass drum. And with that, the very fast percussive sections in the works have been very similar every time. I think it's because in order to just interpret that gesture, you're going to be limited to only so many sorts of techniques. Mm-hmm. Whereas the longer gestures have been interpreted very differently by different players. The way that I notated those gestures also had a great deal of freedom for the player. Because it's an open instrumentation piece, I couldn't specify technique. So I would just write descriptors of a sort of sound that I hoped the player would be able to achieve. And often that sound is morphing to another description of another sort of sound. Mm-hmm. So I would say woody and vibrant, or cold, still, and metallic. And I would hope that the player would be able to achieve that sort of sound on their instrument. And it would be up to them to decide on what sort of techniques would evoke that sound. And there were some different techniques from different players with those long gestures.
So on the subject of existentialism, I imagine that many of the descriptors that you're choosing to kind of feature in each of these different points. So like if we're traveling from something that's woody to something that's metallic, those two things, as it relates to existentialism, are somewhat symbolic in a sense. Would you mind discussing a bit about how these different specific types of sound relate to the subject of existentialism, and kind of in general, I guess this also relates back to what you had mentioned before about, once you've kind of digested all of the elements of a certain style and you now have something to say, what exactly is the comment that you're trying to make about the subject of existentialism?
The title Existentialism in Sound is an interesting play, at least interesting to me, on a Michael Finnessy title, which I always thought to be very perplexing, but nevertheless very interesting. It was called The History of Photography in Sound. It's a massive work for solo piano, and I was just always very attracted to that title. Like, what does it mean? The history of photography in sound. Like, how is that possible? Especially then to know that it's several hour-long solo piano work. Like, what's the relationship between these things?
Sure.
So
certainly a challenge.
Right. At the time, I was reading a lot of quotes from Nietzsche on the topic of solitude and isolation. As I had mentioned before, I wrote this primarily when I was at this artist residency in Bavaria, and it was really nice to have the solitude to focus on the work. But on the other hand, it can be very isolating in a bit of an anxious way, where you're just grappling with these topics day in, day out. I don't speak any German, so it's not like I could interact with the townspeople much. So yeah, there was that. The real relationship beyond just the nod to Michael Finnessy is the transformation of the soloist. I wanted to write a piece where the soloist would begin the work expressing his or her musical voice through their respective instrument. And I knew that with this sort of work, you would have performers who have trained their entire life on that instrument. So there's a very close association between their musical voice and their instrument. And then I wanted, at some point in the work, to gradually divide their musical voice to just their inherent body and take the physical instrument away from them. Mm-hmm. And then you're just left with this isolated, still very musical person, but stripped of their typical voice, and then the soloist is just relying on their actual voice. So that's at the end, you have the language elements, and it then gets stripped away to just breathing. So this notion of solitude with the Nietzsche was really playing into the treatment of the soloist.
It's clearly a highly individualistic piece. It occurs to me also, just by the statements that you've just made, that it's something which is a personal transformation on the part of the performer, but also that's reflected in the process that you kind of brought to the piece as well. So there's some degree of transmission of your own personal transformation through the performance of the piece in a certain sort of sense. How did you find that your own experience of listening to the piece related to the compositional process that brought it to life in the first place?
I feel like this piece, and probably most of my works, when I listen to them, it feels like a sonic representation of my own intellectual interests. So when I hear existentialism in sound, I'm thinking about my grappling with the Nietzsche text. I think about my experience living in Germany that summer. I think about just the creative process that I know of isolation and solitude being elements necessary to create something that is very focused and rigorous. It can't be among other people the same way that a lot of jobs are. I require a certain amount of space just to really focus on these techniques, these compositional ideas. But it's also difficult. It's a strange duality where it's something that isn't easy on me psychologically or emotionally, sometimes even physically. You end up depriving yourself of certain worldly things. Exactly. But it also is something that I feel driven to undertake. It's a hardship that I'm passionate about the outcome.
Yeah, you're taking on kind of the heaviest weight that you can bear, and then kind of using that to propel you forward in terms of how far can you carry that thing, with the understanding that you'll end up at a new place that you hadn't, you were not able to attain had you not gone through that process of transformation in the first place.
Exactly.
Maybe we should listen to the next piece now then.
Sure.
So this is a Spike of Resistance. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about this before we listen?
This was composed for Line Upon Line. Line Upon Line is a percussion trio from Texas, and I wanted to follow up on the indeterminate instrumental aspects of existentialism and sound, but now within a chamber music scenario with more than one player. So I developed this pitch band notation with existentialism and sound that I then expand upon with a spike of resistance. And what's nice about these works for indeterminate instruments is it invites so many different perspectives. I have an upcoming performance that I revised the work a bit, where it's no longer for percussion trio, but for violin, cello, and bass drum. So this is the premiere recording for percussion trio, but there's an upcoming Luxembourg performance of a totally different version of the same idea.
Sounds great, and we'll talk about that right after we listen.
Yeah, it was a real blast working with those guys.
Well, what a great performance of that piece. One thing that occurs to me, kind of following up with something that you mentioned, is this was composed technically in a very similar sort of way that you composed the last piece, in the sense that you're providing kind of a series of descriptive information by which the performers can kind of elaborate and flesh out the gestures that are contained therein. So one thing that occurs to me is that in connecting these two pieces to a sort of similar trajectory or a similar sort of continued study, that you're kind of engaging in a kind of a study of performance practice in a certain sort of sense. So the first piece, existentialism and sound, being a kind of focus on the individual, where obviously it was inspired by the philosophy of Nietzsche and other kind of existentialist thought, where you're dealing with isolation, which kind of gives birth to an individualist kind of take on this type of technique. But that in this piece, you've made the shift from the individual to the group. And so I'm curious to see how that technique, after it had been sort of divorced from the individual perspective, how that changed in terms of what you got out of it as a composer when you moved from the individual to the group.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There was at least one, if not a few works between the two pieces that we just heard.
I see.
And one of the works that immediately followed Existentialism and Sound was a work for trombone duo with implanted Bluetooth speakers entitled A Dialogue in Absentia. And with that, I was still very concerned with isolation and solitude and the sort of breaking apart of one's musical voice into these discrete elements and playing with this movement between the voice as an instrumentalist and the voice just as a human being. I felt like I had explored that a few different times since Existentialism and Sound, that when it came time for this work, I just wanted to focus on developing the pitch band notation and that sort of pitch language.
So it became separated over time from the unified world in which it was created, I say.
Yeah. With Existentialism and Sound, the soloist part was largely composed intuitively based on the electronics part. I had written the electronics part in full beforehand, and then I wanted to have a soloist kind of respond to or ignore at various points what the electronics was doing. The electronics part was algorithmically generated, and I like the idea of then trying to create an algorithmically generated notation. Not a notation that is informed by algorithms and then notated, but something that is literally the computer is spitting out notation and then it is done. Like, closed book. This is what the computer had notated. And you get this weird, jaggedy pitch band line that was very much in line with how I was composing some of the gestures with Existentialism and Sound, but far more nuanced than I could have done by hand because it was computer generated. So it kind of at times looks like a graphic of a stock ticker, or the very nuanced, somewhat unpredictable movements of data over these bands.
So that generates kind of a complex, unified sort of entity that you're then kind of looking within, I guess, to find how it can be separated into different voices?
Yes, but I had several streams being generated concurrently.
I see. Okay.
So in that case, I didn't need to separate it. But what I am doing is saying, like, okay, here are the structural points of the piece. This is how it's going to function. It's going to do this, and then it's going to add this other player, and then it's going to have these. So I knew kind of the outline, and then I was programming these algorithms to create the content, and I could cull through the content to find what content fit my outline.
Sure.
That was one of the big goals with a spike of resistance.
And so, something else that occurs to me is in hearing these two pieces, and hearing you describe the type of way that you approached each of these pieces, that there is you seem to have a continual drive to kind of separate the compositional process from yourself in a certain sort of sense. So you're beginning, it's part of the challenge in a sense. It's like in existentialism and sound, you're kind of saying, okay, well, what happens if I sort of divorce the idea of individual instruments from the piece that I'm composing, so that I am kind of just composing music rather than composing music for a certain instrument. And then in this one, you're kind of separating that a bit further also, because you're saying, I not only want to separate it from the instruments, but I also want to separate it from the individual gestures that are kind of being derived from it. More, the gesture itself is the algorithmic process that produces a complexity of information that I can then go through and find the things that that my aesthetic interprets to be valuable, that are worth keeping and featuring and highlighting and this sort of thing.
Right.
How do you see this type of, well, if you agree with that premise in the first place, how do you see this kind of thought process continuing in future pieces, or in pieces that you're working on at the moment?
I think since A Spike of Resistance and since Existentialism and Sound, I have explored different algorithmic means of generating material much more. The notion of creating an algorithm that is outputting finished notation is something that's very attractive, given how much time it takes to accurately represent some of the notation that I've developed. Something that takes a few minutes to jot down on a piece of paper could be a painstaking several-day process of accurately representing through Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. It's unfortunate that I have such bad handwriting, because I think it is necessary. It's a necessary step to get a digital version of this that's clean and kind of optimized for performance. That being said, I'm not sure if I'm going to continue with this algorithmic generation of notation. I think I've sort of done that a few times with different works. I did that with a few pieces for larger ensembles, where I'm generating several streams of this pitch band notation, but then also having other instruments playing more standardized notation. And I feel like I've done, at least at this point in time, what I want to do with that, and I'm much more interested in creating systems to arrive at complex musical schemes that I can then interpret how I wish, in terms of orchestrating them, or in terms of specific instrumental techniques.
Is it the case that each piece you compose kind of explores the same or a different, a new system by which you're kind of determining a different kind of value? Or have you experimented in pieces where there are multiple systems kind of going on at the same time? So, for example, could you envision, or have you envisioned, a piece that uses the system of notation used in existentialism and sound alongside an algorithmically developed material? So maybe, on top of each other concurrently, or else one section deals with one type of notation, another deals with another type of generation.
I have. The middle movement from a series for large ensemble called Adhocracies does just that.
I see.
Where it combines the pitch band notation with other forms of notation, switches back and forth. It kind of takes these two worlds that I've developed concurrently and allows them to mingle a bit. And I think that was very interesting for its purpose. I think I'd like to then, at least at this point in time, go back to developing them as separate things. I think mixing them does have this very interesting result, but it's also a singular result. It's not a result that I feel, if I did again, would result in something different, at least at this point in time.
Well, it's more that the interplay between two different types of things would produce some sort of relationship, which is explorable, right?
Right, but that relationship is a well-defined relationship, where if I had the same two things that were paired together in the future, the same relationship would be present, rather than some strange, mystery, different relationship in the future.
Sure.
Which is great that such a result is like an interesting musical result, but I'm always interested in well, what's next? How can I take it further?
I see. So these are obviously fairly complexly conceived of schemes that you're working with. When listening to the piece or various pieces of yours, often the effect is pretty immediate. And it seems to me that there's this kind of hidden world from which you're composing that's sort of designed at kind of aiming towards a specific kind of effect or exploring a specific kind of effect or mechanism. When you're at a social event, let's say at a party or after a concert perhaps, and you're speaking with musicians, I can imagine that these kinds of terms translate pretty well, because someone who understands the terms that you're using could pretty easily come to the same conclusions that you're drawing. When you're discussing these sorts of things with non-musicians or people who are just part of the general public, do you find that what are some of the challenges of getting these types of ideas across? How do you introduce yourself? How do you introduce what it is you do?
I feel as though introducing what I do to the general public is a huge part of my life as a composer, and also one of the most difficult tasks for a modern composer, because you're describing you're trying to describe using language that everyone would be familiar with, concepts that are inherent to specialized terms. So it's hard to very succinctly translate these very specialized concepts into a more generalized mode of working. Often what I'll end up doing is just describe a single piece. I'll say, well, let me tell you about a piece I just finished, and then walk them through the functionality of that piece and kind of what you were talking about in terms of a lot of the works have this surface level that someone could enter into, even if there's a lot of complexity and advanced structures just below the surface. There is, or at least I hope, this visceral, immediately apparent element to any listener, where you're confronted with something that is tangible, like it's a tangible entity that is striking them and eliciting a very emotional response. I think for me, Ligeti is a model for how that's achieved. You have these works, Atmospheres or his Requiem, which are incredibly complex in terms of his use of pitch and polyphony. Any listener would still be affected on a very emotional level upon hearing them, and that's why they've been used to great success in the Stanley Kubrick films.
Right, yeah.
I'm kind of aiming for a similar ideal reception where there's some emotional, visceral response, and the deeper levels are there for those who wish to explore them, but not necessary in order to have a takeaway.
Well, it seems to me also that, perhaps it's the fact that you're attempting, or maybe not attempting, but it's part of your own history, that you were kind of grappling with several different worlds, and one of them being the classical realm, which is sort of, you might describe as sort of the deeper, more detail-oriented, technical music in a sense. Whereas rock music, what probably initially drew you to it was not just the technical proficiency of the guitarist, but also the forceful impact of many of the songs. And so it seems to me that you probably have coming from rock music in a certain way gives you that public perspective that you're trying to kind of reach back and it allows you to kind of converse with the public in a way that you yourself have experienced in the past before. But also at the same level, you're trying to preserve that kind of visceral intensity that drew you to rock music in the first place. And perhaps that's the sort of spirit that you're trying to encase within a more complex classical language.
I would say so. I think that I have this sense that's very hard to articulate of what is my aesthetic. And it is exactly what you mentioned, this mixing of like an immediate, visceral, often aggressive or distorted quality, saturated quality, with these more classically influenced, or we can even say within the contemporary music sphere.
Well, it's like a refined intensity or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That being said, I'm always trying to imagine the ideal audience member as myself. So I can't really say with certainty how other audience members are perceiving this relationship between the intensity of like, rock and the classical structure. I'm just trying to kind of follow my own ideal aesthetic.
It's something that, you are the litmus test by which a piece will work for somebody else, perhaps. If it works for you, then there's probably somebody else out there who feels the same way that you do. Exactly,
especially, with the globalization that we have today. You put it up there and hope that the 7 billion plus people out there, there's some other listeners who have a shared aesthetic preference.
Absolutely. So kind of moving forward then, where do you see your music going in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, we've talked a bit about where you came in the past, the kind of things that you're working on now a bit. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the projects that you're working on at the moment and the types of trajectories that you see these leading towards into the future.
There have been a few projects that I have worked on recently which involve augmented instruments. So this is building some sort of electronic mechanism or some device to extend the possibilities of a pre-existing instrument. Typically, these are pre-existing instruments that you would find within a normal orchestra. And I found that to be a very fertile area of exploration, at least within my music. And I can definitely see myself building more augmented instruments. One of the pieces I had mentioned already, a dialogue in absentia. Here I have these two tenor trombones that I purchased Bluetooth speakers and then modified the Bluetooth speakers to function as electronic mutes that fit inside the bell of each instrument. And rather than play sounds out of the bell in the traditional sense, they direct not all, but most of their electronic playback through the instrument, exiting the mouthpiece. So you have an instrument functioning as a complex filter where you move the slide and it in real time modulates the sound as it's exiting the instrument. And then the player could also filter the sound using the different formants of the mouth based on different mouth shapes. And that was a very rich learning experience. And I definitely see myself doing more of that. Even the piece that I just shared, A Spike of Resistance, I was building these monochords to exist on top of different drum surfaces. And you have a percussion trio functioning as some strange ad hoc string trio. That sort of thing is really fascinating to me. And I definitely see myself doing more of that work in the future.
Where does from challenges like that, I understand that they're challenging in the sense that they're things that you have not yet confronted before. I'm curious, in particular with regard to augmenting instruments or even inventing instruments and creating, new challenges by which you can kind of contend with. In that particular sense, what do you find comes out of instruments that you have not yet explored? Do you find that it helps you separate yourself more from the stylistic cliches that would normally be associated with a certain instrument? So, for example, if you're writing for the guitar, one reason why you might distance yourself from the guitar is because you're a guitarist, and every time you sit down to to play the guitar, you probably end up noodling around the same sorts of things from your bag of tricks. Do you find that distancing yourself further from certain instruments through augmentation allows you a certain distance, which gives you a fresher perspective?
Definitely. Your point about the guitar is very apt. So I feel like when I'm approaching instrumental writing, I'm constantly aware of what has been done. I wouldn't say that I am obsessed with the novel, but I definitely appreciate an approach that offers something new. It could just be expanding the corpus of what has been done a little bit. That's okay. But every work I do want to have as a contribution. And I feel like this is more of a viewpoint shared as kind of like a researcher of music, where if you're going to take the time and effort and struggle to write a new piece of music, it should contribute to the body of music that is being written today in a novel way. Mm-hmm. Of course, everything is based on and influenced by and informed by everything else, but you should still try to do something a little different, if not as different as you think is appropriate.
Yeah, well, tradition needs to evolve in order to remain alive.
Right, and I feel like composition today should not be a museum piece. It should be a living, thriving, artistic endeavor. Creating augmented instruments is one way to very quickly separate the constraints from the past. There are other works for trombone, of course, in our repertoire, but there's not that many works with these mutes that I built. So that's an easy way to start a bit fresh.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for coming by and having this conversation with us. It was great to listen to your music and get to know you a bit better.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I'm glad to.
Great. Thank you very much.
Time.
Lots.
Time.
That was our interview with Andrew Watts, an American composer living in San Francisco, California. More of his music is available at andrewawatts.com.
If you would like to hear more episodes, new interviews are broadcast on the radio Fridays at 2 p.m. Pacific Time through KZSU 90.1 FM, as well as on Composer Overtime's YouTube and SoundCloud.
Zero.